Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. Very exciting to see such a room full of exciting people. My name is Susanna Burkauer. I'm a professor of business economics and public policy, and my work is on how climate affects inequality. So I want to mention three things during this talk. I want to start with some facts about the electricity sector, why this matters for climate, why it matters for inequality, and when we're thinking about poverty in the US and across the world. And then I want to mention two projects that I've been working on in particular in this research area. So first off, some facts about the electricity sector. Energy use generates 75% of annual CO2 emissions. So if we want to seriously reduce CO2 emissions, we have to start thinking about how to reorganize our electricity sector, both in the US and abroad, thinking about how utilities might actually switch to renewables. Second, low-income families often have the highest energy burden. They spend significant sums of money on their utility bills, often 10 or even 20% because of the housing that they live in, because of their low incomes, and because of the high costs of energy. Third, local emissions from energy use, such as sulfurs and NOxes and particulate matter, are often concentrated in low-income neighborhoods where people live near power plants or other industrial areas that worsen their health outcomes, in addition to them having less access to good health care. And fourth, poor power quality, such as power outages or voltage fluctuations, which are incredibly common in a lot of low-income countries, can have really detrimental effect for economics and tend to be concentrated in areas where people don't have a voice to improve their power quality and people who don't have influence. So this is what motivates me to do research and what excites me to see if we can change some of these things. And there's two projects that I want to mention in terms of what I've been working on. So one project that I've been working on is Kenya's national rural electrification program. They have a goal of connecting all Kenyans to the grid. They've been massively successful, but we want to understand how this is actually happening on the ground, how you can improve governance, reduce corruption in a setting where this is being financed by the World Bank and by the African Development Bank. So when you have these large multilateral organizations funding projects all across the country, in this case, thousands of villages all across the country, we go and we visit each of these villages. We try to map out the electricity network, identify and survey the low-income households who are getting electricity to understand their experience on how we can improve governance and reduce corruption in these types of national infrastructure projects. The second project that I want to mention studies deteriorating energy infrastructure and how this might worsen power outages and voltage fluctuations. And here we're working with an engineering team who has developed these sensors that can monitor power outages, and they can detect this in real time. It sends data up to the cloud. And we've been deploying these across the capital city of Ghana, Accra, to measure how investments in the energy infrastructure there, whether they're improving power quality or not. And so what we've been seeing so far, first of all, we have deployed the devices in a bunch of different sites across the city, 150 different sites. And you can see in some sites, the power quality is very good. It's mostly green. That means the voltage is where it should be. In some sites, power quality is incredibly bad, where voltage is much lower than what is actually needed to operate machinery or other things that you would need to run a successful business. So you can imagine how that might worsen people's ability to generate incomes and generate profits. And so the second part of this project, we've been evaluating these investments that were made by the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a US organization that's similar to it's kind of an international investment agency. And they've been investing in the grid in Ghana, and we want to understand whether those investments are actually improving the grid. And so what we've seen so far is right after that construction period in January 2021, we see that the sites that received those investments have much higher voltage quality. That's the line in red. And in fact, their average voltage quality is now right at 230, which is what voltage is supposed to be in Ghana. So we see some initial encouraging results, and we're right now surveying households and businesses in these areas to see whether this also translates to economic gains. I'll end there, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone. I don't have slides. Those of you who've taken classes with me know that I don't use PowerPoint. So I'm a philosopher. I'm a little bit unusual among the Wharton faculty in that way, too. One of my research areas is climate ethics. So I think and write about what our obligations are when it comes to helping to address the threat of climate change. One of the papers I've been working on recently is about the ethics of offsetting the risks that are imposed by our emitting activities. So, of course, there are a lot of important empirical questions about offsetting that you may have come across. Does it really work? Are the organizations that sell offsets reliable and trustworthy, and so on? But as a philosopher, I focus on questions that can't be addressed with empirical methods alone, like what forms of offsetting are kind of in principle morally acceptable and which, if any, aren't, and why. So recently, a couple of other philosophers, Christian Berry and Garrett Cullity at the Australian National University, have a paper arguing that while one form of offsetting is morally acceptable, another isn't. Specifically, they think that what they call offsetting by sequestering is okay, while offsetting by what they call forestalling isn't. So an example of offsetting by sequestering would be planting enough trees to capture an amount of CO2 equivalent to what you've released through your emitting activities. So this sequesters pollution that's kind of equivalent to what you've caused. And that's contrasted with offsetting by forestalling. An example of that would be paying other people to use, say, cooking methods that release less CO2 than the methods that they would have used had you not paid them. So the net result of offsetting by forestalling might be the same as the net result of offsetting by sequestering. But nevertheless, Berry and Cullity think that offsetting by forestalling doesn't make your emitting activity okay, while offsetting by sequestering does. So that's kind of an interesting claim. Why do they think this? Well, they argue by using a method that's common in philosophy. So they argue by analogy. And they rely on intuitions about the cases that figure in the analogy. So here's how the analogy goes. Offsetting emissions by sequestering, they say, is like going boating in a river, where your boating releases some amount of a toxin, and then paying to run an extracting device, right? So you've got an extracting device that removes an equivalent amount of the toxin from the river. Offsetting emissions by forestalling, on the other hand, they say, is like paying your neighbor who was planning to go boating without running an extractor to cancel his trip and then going boating yourself in place of your neighbor. Right? And they think that intuitively, while boating and extracting, running the extracting device seems clearly okay, paying your neighbor and then replacing his planned boat trip with yours seems wrong, doesn't seem like it's an acceptable way of offsetting. So I argue that there's less of a morally important distinction here than Berry and Cullity claim, but I argue that they are onto something that could be problematic about thinking that offsetting by forestalling is always okay. So to see the core of the argument that I make, imagine that it costs $100 to extract toxins equivalent to one boat trip. Now imagine that your neighbor is willing to cancel his wrongful boat trip, wrongful because he wasn't planning on extracting, for only $50. So if we treat offsetting by forestalling as acceptable whenever the net effect on emissions of your emitting and offsetting is the same as the net effect on emissions of offsetting by sequestering would be, then your neighbor's wrongfully intending to go boating without extracting could make it cheaper for you to permissibly go boating and release toxins into the river. And that, I think, is something that we should reject, at least in cases where paying what would be the full costs of offsetting by sequestering, that is, extracting, can improve things for people who are at risk, say, downstream of the toxins in the river, even more. So my view is it's okay to pay your neighbor $50 to cancel his boat trip and to go boating yourself, but only if you also do $50 worth of extracting, which would actually make the net effect of your boating, paying your neighbor, and extracting a kind of reduction overall in the amount of toxin in the river. So it would be better than if you just did none of those things for the people downstream. So there are a lot of important implications of this argument. We think about these things because there are real-world implications, right, for things like offsetting emissions by forestalling in various ways in the real world, but I don't have time to go into that here. Happy to chat elsewhere if you are interested.
All right, well, first I want to thank the organizer for having me. I am an energy and environmental economist in BEP. I am especially interested in environmental policies and their unintended consequences and how we can improve climate policy design. And I typically look at that in the context of renewable energy markets, carbon markets, lots of studies on cars, and then policies that aim to prevent deforestation. And today I would like to talk about cars because transportation is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and it's an even larger share of local pollution, such as carbon monoxide and NOx. And that's what I want to talk about because inspired by the Volkswagen scandal, I wanted to know, do these vehicle exhaust standards that aim to reduce local emissions from cars, do they actually work? So vehicle exhaust standards are regulation on maximum emissions rates for new vehicles in the US in grams per mile. And automakers comply with them by essentially innovation. They install technologies to make cars cleaner. The prime example would be catalytic converters a couple decades ago and subsequent complementary technologies. And these are critically important environmental policies, but they're hugely understudied. So I and a group of co-authors wanted to answer the question, first of all, what has happened to air pollution from vehicles over time? Have the standards caused the reductions that we've seen? And then third, what if we had chosen a different policy? What would other alternative counterfactual policies have done? And to answer those questions, we went on a major data hunt collecting over 60 years of data on new vehicle inspections, millions of used vehicle inspections. And then we built this large economic equilibrium model of the new and used car fleet to study what would have happened had we chosen a different policy. So let me first show you some data. So you're looking at carbon monoxide. You can see before the regulation began in 1967, no action, flat emissions rates. But then the moment the regulation started, emissions started to go down really rapidly to the point where a car today, a new car, is about 200 times as clean as it was in the 1960s. So that's really good news. The same as holds, by the way, for hydrocarbons and NOx. And our research shows that this is not just a coincidence. Actually, the standards caused these declines. So that's the good news. The bad news is that when a car is born, right, it stays on the road for quite a while, and the same car gets dirtier and dirtier as it ages. So this graph shows you that a car, when it's 25 years old, is about 3 times as polluting on average than when it was 4 years old, when you look at NOx. But it's 20 times more polluting on average when you look at carbon monoxide. So cars really get very dirty. And this is really critically important because it shows you that there's a small group of super polluters on the road, a small number of cars. But because those cars were already dirtier when they were new 25 years ago, and then you add 25 years of wear and tear, they're really extremely dirty. So the question is, how can we get rid of those old cars? And I want to contrast 2 different policies. One would have been, what if we had set tighter standards 20 years ago? Well, I mean, that would have led to lots, basically the experiment is, what if we had phased in the standards 4 years earlier in every given year? It would have led to many more clean new vehicles, like the RAV4 Prime that I'm a proud owner of. It would have given us $117 billion in gains and 8% less pollution today than what we have now. But the other policy would be to really target those very old super polluters. What if we just let drivers pay for the pollution of their cars, so charge a very high fee to the owners of these old cars? It would lead to massive scrappage, right? And scrapping all those old vehicles also makes space, again, for lots of new vehicles, more efficient vehicles, because it became so expensive to drive these old cars. So that's an even better policy that would have given us many more dollars in gains, but a whopping 37% reduction in pollution. So this is a clear winner from an environmental perspective. The issue, though, is that who owns these old cars? They're typically poorer households that now face the burden of paying for very high annual fees. I'm working on a next project to study exactly that, so stay tuned maybe for next year, and I can tell you the answer of how the benefits and costs are distributed. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Arthur. Great to be here. I'm also a professor of statistics at Wharton, and I spend much of my life sort of doing the interface of finance and statistics and economics and statistics. And it's hard these days, as you know, to do that without bumping into climate. It's sort of everywhere in terms of climate finance, macro climate, and so on. And lately, I've gotten into climate, and we've been working, I and some team members have been working on Arctic sea ice, which sounds a little bit exotic. It might be for you, it is for me, but it's actually fundamental to a lot of things because Arctic sea ice is sort of like a window into the future. There are amplification mechanisms that have caused it to warm and continue warming 2 to 3 times as fast as the global average. And as you know, the global average is itself problematically increasing. So I thought I'd show you a little bit about that today. Of course, everybody knows that global climate and temperature increases in particular lead to sea ice melting. No big surprises there. But the feedback mechanisms amplify that. As things warm and sea ice melts and permafrost melts, well, the albedo, the reflectivity of the Arctic drops. You know, snow and ice are kind of white, and open sea is kind of black, and that absorbs a lot more heat, right? And simultaneously, as permafrost melts, it releases methane, which is way, way worse than CO2. So you've got all that going on, and that leads to so-called Arctic amplification. Now, this is very geophysical, this piece of work that we're doing here. It's the kind of thing you'd see in nature or science. Right at the moment, it's not so economic or so financial, but we have definitely in mind sort of motivational issues that we're going to get to as soon as we can. It's just a question of getting the facts straight first. So right now we're trying to get the facts straight. But think about various costs and benefits of Arctic warming. Of course, we all tend to think a lot about the costs. You know, increased emissions increases warming globally. There's environmental damage due to particulates and discharges and spills and soot deposits. You know, there's a lot of negative stuff that goes on with warming. And then as the planet warms more broadly, of course, the sea level rises as land ice, not sea ice, but land ice melts and so on. But there are benefits, of course, economically as the Arctic opens up as well. You know, we all might have different views about how they trade off, but there are going to be newly accessible deposits of natural gas, petroleum, other sorts of natural resources, fisheries, things like that. In addition, and crucially from a global trade point of view, as the Arctic sea ice melts and trans-Arctic shipping becomes possible in August, September, October, kind of reliably possible, you know, that's going to cut the transportation time and cost from something like Rotterdam to Tokyo in half. You know, so this is a big deal potentially for global trade. And there are lots of geopolitical aspects related to that. You know, who owns the sea lanes? And who says you own them? I say I own them. And you know, you can see a lot of stuff that is already happening, but it's going to continue happening. And so, you know, we've got some papers on this. The first paper is all about projecting business as usual in a statistical econometric way. And much as it pains me to distill a paper into one little picture, this is it, right? So the white area is history. The gray area, starting where we are now, is the future. And under business as usual, you can see the sea ice hitting zero, and zero isn't even the most interesting thing because, you know, sea ice is never going to be exactly zero. There's sort of land-fast ice and so on. So people tend to talk about a nearly ice-free Arctic rather than a totally ice-free Arctic, where nearly means about 1 million square kilometers, not zero. So that would be here, right? And that's like in about 2040. And it turns out that this is incredibly robust. to lots of things that you can do that I won't go into now, but I'd be delighted to talk if you're interested. So in the most recent research, we say, well, wait a minute, there's not just sea ice area, there's also extent and volume and thickness, and these things are all related. And when any one of them hits zero, they all must hit zero. So we can bring a lot more information to bear on the problem by modeling these things together or in pairs. And that's what we've been doing. And by constraining the ice-free Arctic, say in this case for area and extent at the same time, which we know must happen, we can refine the predictions. Here we've moved into a so-called carbon trend as well. So we're projecting gigatons of carbon. What's that going to be when we hit an ice-free Arctic? If we run through that through some of the so-called SSP scenarios, different scenarios that people use for thinking about future emissions, we can get out the projected trends that sort of match up what we were looking at a minute ago. And you can see same sort of thing, near ice-free Arctic in about 2040. We've got a lot of dialogues going with the climate people. They used to say, you're crazy. You're telling me the ice is going to be gone much sooner than our models do. And I would say, well, maybe your models need a little bit of rethinking. And now they tell me, well, this is obvious. Everybody knows this. So things, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But we're working on it.
So I've been working on how climate change is affecting the stock market. And I want to start with a question for all of you. The question is, over the last decade, which do you think performed better, green stocks or brown stocks? So a green stock is an environmentally friendly stock. A brown stock is an environmentally unfriendly stock, like a coal stock. So raise your hand if you think over the last decade, green stocks outperformed brown. All right, and how many think brown outperformed green? Okay. The answer is that green outperformed, all right? So what we've done here is we created two stock portfolios. We took the third of stocks that are the most environmentally friendly. We call those the green stocks. Here are the third of stocks that are the dirtiest stocks. And over the last 10 or so years, green outperformed brown, and not just by a little, but by like 174 percentage points. So now, a different question for you. What about the next 10 years? Do you expect green stocks to continue outperforming brown over the next 10 years? Raise your hand if yes, you expect green to outperform over the next 10 years. A lot of people say yes, you expect green to outperform. We say the opposite. All right? Why do we say the opposite? First, we ask an intermediate question. Why did these green stocks outperform over the last decade? And our prediction or our hypothesis is that what was special about the last decade is that we all became much more concerned about climate change. And you can measure that. We measure that with this red line. You can measure the level of concern about climate change by reading the newspaper every day, or letting a computer read the newspaper every day for you, and measuring how many climate stories there are, how negative they are, how scary these stories are. And we measure kind of the unexpected amount of news every month. And this red line shows the cumulative climate concern shocks. Starting in late 2012, we see this huge run-up in concern about climate. And that coincides with this blue line, which is the cumulative return you would have gotten by buying green stocks and shorting brown. So the trends line up, but you also see some of the wiggles line up. So what that tells you is when people become more concerned about climate change, that tends to be good news for green stocks. It tends to be bad news for brown stocks. And it makes sense, right? If we all become really concerned about climate change, we expect governments to act, right? Things like carbon taxes might become more likely. A carbon tax is really bad news for a brown stock, right? But it's actually pretty good news for a green stock. So then we do something a little tougher. We ask, what if the last decade had been different? What if in the last decade we had not become more concerned about climate? What would this return have been like on green minus brown stocks? And what we find is that, well, what you would have gotten is this red line. If the last decade had been different, if we had not become concerned about climate, actually green would have underperformed brown, right? So what we're saying is the only reason green outperformed is because the last 10 years were very special. What was special about the last 10 years is there was this huge growth in concern about climate change. And this is what leads me to say, no, I do not expect green stocks to outperform going forward, right? what leads me to say that is this downward trend. Once you take away these unexpected shocks to climate concerns, well, we actually would have seen green underperforming brown. Why should you care about this? First of all, there's an implication for ESG investors, and this is the bad news. Our message is that you should not expect the strong recent performance of green stocks to continue. You should also care if you care about the planet. It's actually good news for the planet that green firms have lower expected returns going forward. You have to remember that a stock's expected return is the same thing as cost of capital. And if you care about the planet, you want green stocks to have a low cost of capital. Because if we have a low cost of capital on green firms, that creates an incentive for all firms to become greener. It also induces green firms to expand their operations. It expands dirty firms to make their operations smaller, leading to a positive environmental impact. Thank you.
So what I'm going to try to answer in the next 5 minutes is a little bit of the question, why is an accountant here? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically combine a couple of papers that I have together with two co-authors, one at UCLA and one here at Wharton. And effectively what we're sort of trying to do is we're going to try to take Luke's work, and especially Luke's analytical work, where he sort of builds a capital market equilibrium, and trying to push this into a direction where managers make choices and where fund managers make choices. So in part, sort of what motivated us is the question, how do we lessen at least the impact of climate change? And the answer is incredibly simple, which is all of us need to change our behavior, which is also a very, very difficult question to sort of answer. Because we know that all of us don't typically change our behavior, so somehow we have to motivate people. Economists have done a lot of work in this area and basically figured out that pretty much anything that we can do is also very, very hard to do, right? Taxes are a four-letter word in politics. Taxes, as Arthur told us just a couple minutes ago, may be the most effective way to dealing with this. So somehow we have to find other alternatives. Now, one of the things that Luke is trying to suggest here is that capital markets may be able to play a small role or a role in this. How big, we'll see. So the fundamental question here is, how do we deal with externalities, right? One firm's choice has an impact on other people outside of that firm. When you think back to your finance classes, externalities and the view of a portfolio is sort of inherently there when you sort of think about a CAPM or something, right? As an investor, all of our finance classes tell us, think of your portfolio. Don't think of an individual stock, just think of the whole portfolio. And then you say, wow, that means like the whole externality should be priced in, and that's great. So then let's talk about an externality. Firm A does something, and firm B sort of gets the effect of that. So where do we deal with it as pricing? Where do we see the externality? Well, if I buy firm A's shares, I get the impact on firm A's cash flows. I don't get B. If I buy A and then also buy B, I get B. But really, the externality I only see in the share of the price of the receiver rather than of the sender. And that's a problem, right? Because we would like to motivate the manager of firm A to not do a bad thing. So how do we get that? How does Luke get that in his model? The answer is relatively simple. We have investors that inherently care about the externality. I would like to buy green shares because I value green shares over and above just their cash flows. And all of a sudden, if that happens, I get pricing effects, and I get sort of the externality priced at A. That's great. So then what do we need? We need these investors to actually be informed. Right? A finance professor has a simple life. He just says everybody knows the greenness of every share. As an accounting professor, I have to say, wait a minute, that may not be the case. Somehow these people have to get information. Accounting, thank you. And so then we sort of have to worry about where's that information coming from? And typically what we see is information is coming from out of firms, and it's a result of managers' actions. So then when we get this heightened interest in greenness and ESG outcomes of firms, what we're going to see is we're going to see managers that care more about the information that's coming out. Therefore, they're going to take more actions that increase the information, therefore increase their price. And they're going to take more actions that make that information look better. Greenwashing, right? We typically see greenwashing as sort of a morally bad thing, and it's something that we need to avoid, and it's going to dampen our effects that we're going to have, and it's going to make everybody worse off. Typically, I would say when we look at an equilibrium model, what we're going to see is that greenwashing tends to be a natural outcome of providing incentives. If I want to provide incentives for change, I'm also going to provide incentives to make it look like I changed. But they tend to go hand in hand, and so typically we can sort of think about greenwashing and positive change as sort of things that go hand in hand with each other, and not necessarily just a bad thing. So then we started thinking more. Now, for the model to work, we need all of us to care. Great. So all of us care. Now, let's say all of us care and we all have some money and we want to invest it. It is really hard to figure out which stocks are green and which stocks are not green, right? I cannot possibly update my beliefs over all of these firms and then change my portfolio according to that. So what do? I delegate my choice. Who do I delegate it to? Funds. So we can all go online, we can buy shares of funds, we can give our money to mutual fund managers, and they make the investment choices on us. That's great. So now let's say we have these investors that care. These investors that care, some green investors, delegate their portfolio choices to fund managers. And then we have green funds that trade in green enough shares, and we have regular funds that just trade in everything. Now let's say the fund managers, what we know about fund managers is that they like to have more assets under management, and fund flows tend to be driven by past returns. So I'm going to put all of that in a model. And then we say the green funds only holds green enough shares. The regular funds is going to sort of trade freely. They're basically going to absorb. They're going to clear the market on the green shares, and they're going to hold everything for the brown shares. As long as I take any frictions out of the market, there's no greenium, there's no premium, there's no benefit of being green. The only thing that's going to happen, everybody's going to earn the same expected return. And green investors are really happy because they get the same expected return. But they also are really good, and they only hold green shares. So in the end, what that leads to is we need incentives for fund managers to actually start investing green, not just investing above a threshold, but actually buying a more green firm. And for that, we need information, and we're back to the reason for accounting to be here in this room. Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about climate and public finance. So public debt is really important. And I would like to convince you all that public debt is one of the ways in which we think we're probably going to finance a lot of climate investments, environmental remediation, lots of things that we do as a society, we fund with different sources of public debt. So we see this happening all around the world. We've seen it a lot in the last few years in Latin America. We've seen Mexico City was the first to issue a municipal green bond. We've seen it in Europe with Germany. Germany was their first $6 billion issue. They've since issued several more green bonds. These are bonds that are designed to finance projects that have some sort of climate impact, hopefully positive. And actually, Philadelphia pretty recently had our first social bond just a few months ago, focusing on some environmentally friendly, low-income housing. And so this public debt, we think, is a really important source of financing for a lot of our environmental remediation going forward. But so what's actually happening with these markets in the US? The US has a $4 trillion municipal bond market. This is what I think of as the source of debt for cities, states, school districts, small districts. There are out in Seattle, Washington has things called mosquito districts. They finance basically everything we do as a society that is a fixed and durable public asset. And so this $4 trillion market, we issue about $400 to $500 billion of bonds a year. These finance, again, basically everything that we actually touch, that we interact with local governments. But in the US, green bonds make up a very small portion of borrowing. So I'll show you here on the left, this is kind of the number of green bonds that have been issued each year since 2011. We see kind of in 2013, there were the first few green bonds issued. It increased a lot through 2021. But actually, and this is up through August, so of course the annualizes on the right side. But here on the left, you can see we've actually seen a pretty big drop in the frequency of municipal bond issues that are marked for green purposes in the last year. If we look as a percent of volume or a percent of frequency of sales, we see that is dropped pretty dramatically. So we were at about 2% of green municipal bonds issued in 2021 were marked as green. That dropped to about 1% this past year. And so we think it's really interesting if these investments are so important, and we think they are, why are we having a hard time financing them, and why is this trend kind of reversing from the last few years of increasing interest in green securities and municipal bonds? Why is this kind of reversing? So this is one thing I would like to look into. That I don't have good results for you today, but I do have some more interesting results on kind of where it happens. So I'll note municipal bonds are issued by most entities in the US. Basically, every county in the US has several municipal bonds issued every year. But if you actually look at which counties are issuing green bonds, it's almost exclusively the richest counties in the US. So it's Washington, D.C., it's Orange County, California, it's Portland, Oregon, it's Austin, Texas. But we don't actually see these investments happening basically anywhere we think they might matter most. So I think that's really important. So we want to know, why aren't we financing a lot of green bonds in the US? One reason might be that public finance is a market that has a lot of political arguments behind it. So there are currently, right now, there are 14 US states that have passed about 50 bills or introduced or passed about 50 bills to try to use their public finance markets to punish banks who have ESG policies. So I have a new paper that's kind of looking at what happened in Texas last year. So Texas passed 2 laws called Senate Bills 13 and 18, which were the Oil and Gas and Firearm Non-Discrimination Acts, which said if you are a bank that, quote, discriminates against firearm manufacturers or oil and gas, you can do no municipal bond underwriting, no managing public investment funds, and no public investments can go to any funds that have an ESG flavor. So we see this happening and all over. It's West Virginia, Florida. It's a thing we need to learn about. So if we try to learn from this experience, I'm going to look at the municipal bond market. These bonds roll over really frequently, which makes it good for learning statistically what happened, because we can see prices reset at a really high frequency that you don't necessarily see in investment management. So what we see is right after this law passed on September 1st of last year, these 2 laws, we saw 5 banks leave the market immediately. So these 5 banks were JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Fidelity Capital Markets. They used to underwrite about 30% of the market. They dropped to 0% right away. So what happens to the rest of the borrowers when we lose access to these banks that choose their ESG policies over their presence in Texas? What we see is uncertainty in the market increases, which I'll kind of, for the sake of time, I won't get into, but we estimate this increased costs by about $300 million to $500 million for the $32 billion in borrowing they did in the first 8 months after this rule. So we think this is really important. I think the final question I want to ask is kind of, how important is public finance going to be for banks and our financial intermediaries adopting ESG policies going forward? Lots of jurisdictions that are reliant on unsustainable or less sustainable industries would like to slow our adoption of climate policies. But we think that there may be systematic risk concerns related to banks not being allowed to or being encouraged to not price certain risks. And so there's a lot of questions here to be said about what's going on with bank balance sheets, what's going on with public statements, again, related to the accounting disclosures. So big questions in public finance, and I hope that you all will take some interest in that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Arthur. Thanks, everyone, for being here once again. My name is Ji-Sung Park, and I'm excited to share with you a couple of recent projects that my colleagues and I have been working on at the intersection of climate change, human capital, and economic opportunity. But let me start with a couple of stylized facts, beginning with the fact that we've baked a lot of warming into the system. In addition to its magnitude and its rapidity, I want to emphasize here the fact that the mapping from a given mean shift in global average temperature, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius, et cetera, to local extreme heat events can vary enormously. For instance, in the United States, there are some parts, some cities, where we can expect upwards of 50 additional days per year with temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century alone. But as you move closer to the equator in places like Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, or Bangkok, Thailand, that number may be closer to 150 additional days. But even if we stick with the US for a minute, how such heat is felt locally may vary enormously depending on things like one's physical infrastructure and, as I'm about to suggest, one's industry and occupation. Okay, fact number 2 is that this warming comes amid rising inequality, particularly between what you might call the educational haves and have-nots of a society. This phenomenon is particularly pronounced in the United States, but it's also been documented in other countries, whether that's in Europe or in East Asia. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what facts 1 and 2 might mean for economic policy, particularly as it pertains to the labor market. And so in one recent paper, my colleagues and I, we teamed up with the California state government, and we wanted to ask, is there a relationship, a meaningful relationship between temperature and workplace safety? And here we're able to exploit a unique data set that comprises the universe of workers' compensation insurance claims in the state over a 20-year period. And as with many studies in the recent climate econometrics literature, what we're able to do is exploit high-frequency weather variation to, in effect, line the data up in such a way that makes it as if nature herself is running a series of natural experiments. And that allows us to get at causality a little bit more cleanly. One of the findings is that heat appears to increase workplace safety risk considerably. A 90-degree plus day increases workplace injuries by anywhere between 8 and 15%. Perhaps surprisingly, we find that the vast majority of these are actually not heat illnesses or other heat-related claims. They're things like falling off of a ladder, getting your hand caught in a conveyor belt, being hit by a moving vehicle. Another perhaps concerning element is that from an equity standpoint, these risks appear to be concentrated highly at the bottom end of the income and skills distribution. These findings are broadly consistent with earlier work that my colleagues and I have done on the effects of heat on learning and human capital, where we use similarly big administrative data sets to explore, among other things, how hotter temperature affects exam performance. So if you took your SAT in a non-air conditioned room on a hot day, you probably did worse than you otherwise would have. But maybe more importantly, from a climate change standpoint, cumulative heat exposure over time appears to reduce the rate of learning and human capital formation for some students more than others. So much so that in the US, we estimate that up to 7% of racial educational achievement gaps may actually be attributable to differences in thermal learning environments that are inclusive of both geography and building conditions like school air conditioning. Okay, so a lot of open questions. I just want to flag two that I'm currently really excited about and working on, which have to do with, what do these and other recent findings suggest about economic policy? Not only about optimal climate mitigation, right, how aggressively we should reduce emissions, but also about the transition period between now and a more stable climate, whether that's in 2050 or 2100. And just two aspects of this. One, how should we think about adaptation, particularly in the workplace, right? And in particular, I'm interested, when do private markets get adaptation right, and when might they fall short? Right? Similarly, I'm interested in thinking about what are the possible labor market implications of the clean energy transition that we're already engaging in, right? And here, I'm curious to know whether we can actually use data to inform who will be the winners from this transition in a labor market sense, and who will be the losers, and what is the role, if any, of government in smoothing that transition. So among many things that I'm excited to potentially work with you on, and with that, I'll pass it over to the next speaker.
The project that I want to talk with you about today is called Greenwashing in the First Amendment, and as we state in the title, this is a project about greenwashing. What is greenwashing? It refers to a set of deceptive marketing practices, often by business firms, but other entities, governments, individuals can engage in greenwashing as well. The focus of this paper really is on the explosion in growth of green marketing claims by business firms. What we're most interested in is why should we care about greenwashing? Well, there are two primary reasons why we want to care about greenwashing, and this has to do with the effects of this potential misinformation in society. We all know that urgent action to address climate change is necessary, as well as other environmental considerations. But the question that greenwashing raises is whether we actually have an accurate picture of what's happening on the ground in the marketplace. And this can affect us in one of two ways, or possibly both. In the one sense, there can be spillovers for policy action. So if we think, for example, that private firms kind of have the situation covered, we may be less inclined to support public policy or regulation on the same subject matter. On the flip side, there may be a sense that some of us are convinced that if a private firm cares about a particular topic, if McDonald's or Exxon is undertaking action to address climate change, maybe I should care about it too. But there is research that shows that when firms make statements about their climate policies, that this does have implications for how supportive people are across the political spectrum in terms of public regulation. The second is that greenwashing can affect consumer choices within the marketplace. If I'm led to believe that product A is recyclable, when it isn't, I might be more likely to purchase product A than product B, which doesn't have a recyclable claim. And again, that can distort my consumer choices, and the consumer choices of many of us add up in the marketplace. We also may be convinced by something called the halo effect that a firm's other products are green if we learn about one product or one service or its energy use being green. So there are reasons to think that greenwashing distorts the marketplace. And so this raises questions about whether marketing claims are factually false. Sometimes they're factually false and it's clear. I'm putting on a certification that's completely fake. I'm making the claim that my product is recyclable when it's not. But sometimes there are much more difficult cases, and those cases are sort of deceptive or misleading, sleight of hand. I'm going to focus on my good environmental performance to distract you from my poor environmental performance on some other metric, or I'm going to focus on my good environmental performance to distract you from my poor performance on some other social metric, perhaps a labor question. And so there are these questions about, are these statements true but nonetheless misleading? And these issues matter. I'm a lawyer, so much like Mirka, why is there an economist here? Why is there a lawyer here? This raises questions about the extent to which these kinds of green marketing claims can be regulated consistent with the First Amendment. Now, it's very important to understand that there has been legal enforcement for many, many years at a number of different levels with respect to marketing claims that could be deceptive. There's enforcement at the federal level by the states. The EU is currently stepping into this space. There's private environmental governance, right? There are certifications to police whether claims are true. There's Twitter shaming. We can get into that. But the current issue on which this question is arising now in the United States is that the Securities and Exchange Commission has recently proposed a new rule that would require certain publicly traded firms to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, as well as if they've made a plan to get to net zero, how do they intend to get there? What are your interim targets? Do you intend to use offsets, et cetera? Even though this is just a proposal pursuant to the regulatory process in the United States, people are allowed to comment on the proposal, so we don't have a final rule yet. But what we know is that many a group of law professors has argued that this rule requiring disclosure of factual information actually violates the First Amendment. Now, our article disagrees strongly with that claim, and of course is correct. And so the animating question of the article is, to what extent can greenwashing be regulated consistent with the First Amendment? It is very important to know that you do not have First Amendment protection for every statement that you make. If you lie in court, perjury, not protected under the First Amendment. You can't lie in court and say, no, but I had a First Amendment right to finger the wrong person, right? You don't get that rule. Why? Because the court is informationally dependent upon witnesses for information to be able to make just decisions. In the same way, we as members of the consuming public are dependent upon firms for certain information about their operations, about their products, about their services. And as a result, we make the argument in this paper that the values that underlie the First Amendment to protect our participatory liberty in the marketplace and to make decisions about what kinds of activities we want to regulate requires our ability to be able to regulate certain kinds of commercial speech. And regulation in this case includes not only restrictions on certain kinds of statements, but also compelled speech along the lines of the SEC disclosure rules. And why is that the case? Our approach basically pushes back on sort of an effort to turn the First Amendment into an all-purpose deregulatory tool. But the implications of this, and this goes to Mirko's point, we want more factual information. So our approach suggests that more factual, truthful information by firms about their operations and about their products is desirable, is legally permitted pursuant to the First Amendment. So thank you very much, and I'm always happy to take questions.